Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, let's go to Europe. We want to speak to friends in Europe and also to a new friend in British Columbia. So, I'm happy to say that we're going to talk about citizens' assemblies today, both a specific citizens' assembly in which I've had some long term experience, and another one, more generic. What is a citizens' assembly as the term is used these days, and compare our notion of what a citizens' assembly should be and how we have actually functioned in the only ones that I have ever known in the past. So good morning, everybody. In British Columbia, Kamloops, I want to say hello to Gisela Ruckert. And
Good morning.
I know you've been on the show before because we had a show about Fair Vote Canada. And one of the things that came up during that conversation was your experience with and strong feelings in favor of using citizens' assemblies for promoting a better representation in governance. And we'll give you a chance to talk about that in a bit. In Edinburgh, Scotland, is Joyce McMillan. Joyce and I had a friendship beginning, she thinks 30 years ago, and I think it couldn't have ended more than 25 years ago. So we've been acquainted, but haven't seen you for that long. And Joyce is a journalist. She's a theater critic and a political analyst. And in Paris, at least I think you're in Paris, is Bernard Driano. Are you in Paris, Bernard?
Yes, I am in Paris.
He's an economist and was also a very key member of the Helsinki Citizens Assembly. It's an organization during the last phases of the Cold War, which brought together peace activists from Western Europe and pro-democracy dissidents in the Eastern European countries. I know that we met mostly, I think, in Czechoslovakia, but there were people also participating from Poland, Hungary, Romania, I don't know where else, probably East Germany, I don't remember. Anyway, Bernard Driano was very engaged with that, and we will give, I think, a little conversation about what we did and how much we got from it, because it was, for me, a very important part of my life, and I find myself enriched to this day from relationships that I've formed there, including with you too.
Of course, I think a citizen assembly is a long and complicated story, so I would try to be brief. It started in the 80s when there was this so-called Euro missiles crisis, the end of the Cold War, the movement for disarmament, etc. At that time, there was what our regretted Mintian Faber, who died a few days ago, was Netherlands. He was one of the founders of Helsinki Citizen Assembly, called the detent from below. I mean, it was an idea not only from Mintian, but he was the one who spread it. The idea is that we had to stick together, a citizen to citizen, east and west, north and south, and not through the states. Precisely detent from below, it's easy to understand what it means. And at this period of the 80s, we developed connections between groups, or include also individuals, but most of these individuals was involved in NGOs, trade unions, etc. From peer to peer. And we created first a network called the East-West Dialogue Network, which brings together people from Eastern and Central Europe and from Western Europe, peace activists, human rights activists, women, feminists, etc. And we decided to make a kind of permanent and general body. It was before the end of the Berlin Wall, but we were expecting the end of the Cold War and the end of the Berlin Wall, which was not at all the mood of the government at that time, and even of public opinion in general. We was working on that, developed this contact. So when there was the end of the communist regime in Eastern Europe, the collapse of Soviet Union, etc., we had already a relatively strong network of people devoted to each other in 30 countries, mainly Europe, but of course, in some of these countries, some of these people were also linked with people outside Europe. And of course, there was also some people from North America from the beginning. So we created a body called the Helsinki Citizens Assembly, the Helsinki being a reference to the Helsinki Agreement of 1975, and to the idea that if you want to have peace, you have to work on the question of security, but also of economic cooperation and of human rights. That's called the Helsinki spirit. So Helsinki is a sort of a symbol, but of course, for the generation, nobody understands what it is about. Why Helsinki? Anyway, we created this group. So we had, it was formal. I mean, there was an office in Prague and an international committee, things like that, which were nearly immediately involved in a question related with peace and war, because some of our members were involved in the post-Yugoslav conflict. And some other people, which were not our members, came to us saying, we want you to help us because you are helping the Yugoslav, the different republics, the different groups to stick together through your international network. We want to do the same thing between people from Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, because we have confronted different types of wars, and we need a space to speak together. That was the idea, and it worked. Let's say it worked really during 10 years. In 10 years, you could say that there was some local sections of local branches, very different from each other. Different. If I use the example of the French branch, which still exists 30 years later. But the French branch was a very, very small group. It is still the same very, very small group. But at the same time, this small group was linked with a sort of web of networks in the French society, which has been developing since. It's more important today than it used to be. Some relatively informal, but it makes that people from different background on different form of activities in society meet together regularly. So we could say the French branch was very small, but at the same time has a lot of contact. Now, if you take that at the same time in the Netherlands, it was very different, because in the Netherlands, it was a mass movement. It's not no more. At that time, it was a very big Christian peace movement, which was a branch in Netherlands. In other country, it was also different, because there was a strong body existing in Turkey, with and the groups in South Caucasus, and there was a big group in Prague. Now there is nothing. So it has different phase, but the body as such, the international body, was really working for 10 years until 2000. It was 5 general assemblies with hundreds of thousands of people, one in Prague, one in Bratislava,
wasn't the last one in Ankara?
No, the last one was in Baku.
Where?
It was in Baku, in Azerbaijan.
Oh, I didn't go to that one. Okay.
Yeah, because you had Prague, then Bratislava, it was quite fruitful, then Ankara in Turkey, and then Tuzla in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It was just after the ceasefire in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It was an incredible event. And the last one was in Baku. Then we collapsed financially, politically, but a lot of people stay in contact.
But the contacts, that's the beauty of it. And I think there are fragments of HCA in different countries. You say in France. I think also in Azerbaijan, there's Arzu is
of course
involved. Okay, I think that's a good introduction. And you mentioned something that I'd like to have us pause and give some reflection to, that our one of the greatest leaders of that movement, Mitjan Faber, died, what is it, about 2 days ago?
Yeah.
And you had sent me that word. I didn't know it. And Joyce Macmillan, who's in Scotland, also is aware of his passing. Joyce, you were telling me a little bit about Mityan. Can we take a minute before we go to Gisela and tell people about the life of this extraordinary person, Mityan Faber? And you can sort of make it up. I know that you did know him well, but we all knew him because he was such a major figure in Helsinki Citizens Assembly.
Yeah, well, as Bernard was saying, I think he and Mary and Bernard and others had originally met through the European nuclear disarmament movement in the 1980s.
We should mention Mary's surname. Mary Caldwell was
Mary Caldwell, yeah, is still a professor in London. She and Mityan were the co-chairs of the organisation, which I should say was not only an activist organisation, it was quite a strongly intellectual organisation. It was connected to a lot of currents of thinking about peace and how to build a good society in Europe round about the period of 1990. Anyway, Mityan was, his home base was an organisation in the Netherlands called IKV, the Netherlands Churches Peace Council. So he came from that kind of background. But he was very, very well known in the Netherlands as a peace activist and organiser. He had a special interest in conflict resolution, and as you were just remembering before we started the formal session, Meta, he had a tremendous gift really for sort of holding the ring in a meeting among people who were involved in severe conflicts. He wasn't a great talker. He usually used relatively few words compared with a lot of the very eloquent people who were involved in HCA, but he had a very, very authoritative presence in the organisation, I would say, and he was coming from a very strong base of sort of mass involvement with peace issues in the Netherlands. So even though he's been very ill for the last decade, really, and hasn't been able to be active, since about 2012, round about then. Nonetheless, his death a few days ago was headline news in the Netherlands. He was a tremendously famous spokesperson and figurehead for the peace movement there. But I think Bernard probably knows him even better than I did, because you knew him earlier on, Bernard. You knew him. I only met him when I came to the first assembly of HCA in Prague in 1990. So you must have known him before that.
Yeah, of course, I knew him 10 years before.
Yeah. Now, I think we should move on and talk about the Citizens Assembly more generally, because one of the things that happened a few months ago, I had a talk show about Fair Votes Canada. Mostly it was about promoting the notion of proportional representation in Canada's elections. So I had several people from that organization, Fair Votes Canada, including Gisela Ruckert. And one of the things that came up there was her interest in and conversation about citizens' assemblies. And I'm going to ask her to explain why that is important. But she got me so interested that I've been thinking about it and even writing about it since then. And it's a major feature of a piece that I'm writing, a long article about how to put together a new world order after this war that will be better than what we've had lately, because the world order that has been holding us together since World War II is definitely not working anymore. So we need to rethink a number of institutions, global multilateral institutions. And I'm impressed by and troubled by what looks to me like a real failure of democracy, because in so many countries, we're finding voters choosing crazies as their leaders, whether we're talking about Trump or Bolsonaro or Duterte or any of the Orban and all of these. Or if you want to go to Britain, I can even name a candidate in London, who I think really represents an irrationality on the part of voters who are making decisions that are contrary to our own interests and, in fact, potentially fatal. I mean, if we don't do climate change, for example, if we're absolutely in denial about what's happening in the world in terms of the weather and the climate, and if we don't, and people don't take vaccines because they don't believe that viruses work, then there's something seriously wrong with us. And we have to look at what's wrong with democracy and what we could possibly do to make a system of governance that is truly responsive to and meeting the needs of ordinary people, citizens. But when voting is not in regular elections as we have them now, it is so widely failing all around the world that I think we've got to think of new systems. So Gisela, I've given you a big chore now to.
No, that's actually a great segue to where I would like to start, Meta, because I think that both what Bernard was saying and what you've just said, Bernard was saying it about an earlier period, but I think we're back in one of those periods where there's a perception that government systems are failing society and failing to address the most pressing issues before us. And we know that trust in government is declining and that there is a need for democratic renewal. So although there are some differences with the Helsinki Citizens Assembly that was described, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail, I think that there's a few similarities that are worth pointing out as well. But the intent with citizen assemblies is to create space for everyday people to wrestle with these big issues that they feel are not getting dealt with effectively by governments right now. And also, to your second point, to create conditions to overcome this polarization, this sort of compartmentalization of society, and to strengthen the bonds between citizens rather than divide us further. And that's a place where citizens assemblies excel in comparison to other, public consultation tools that are often used as, for example, referendums, which tend to polarize and divide us more than bring us together. So I'll just go a little bit into what a citizens assembly now is, what this modern wave, and actually the OECD has produced an excellent study, which I would recommend to people, called the deliberative wave. And that's because we're seeing this increasingly common process being employed in various sectors around the world right now. So in a nutshell, a citizens assembly is a body of citizens formed to deliberate on an important policy issue. So they're based on the evidence that when citizens, average people, are given the knowledge, the resources, the time, they can find solutions to complex and controversial issues. And recommendations by citizens assemblies are likely to be seen by the public as highly legitimate expressions of the popular will. We tend to trust our fellow citizens more than we trust politicians and, even this anti-elite sentiment that's happening right now for people who are chosen to be subject experts. They're often also no longer seen to be as trustworthy as they used to be. So the intent with the Citizens Assembly is to create a mini public, if you will. So they're selected by sortition, a civic lottery, like a jury in many ways, with additional steps taken after that to ensure that the assembly is demographically representative of the population. And they tend to move through a few different stages. So first, the people are brought together and they learn from experts. They look at the evidence. They have access to bring in experts that they would like to hear from. And this is driven by the participants, not necessarily the facilitators of the assembly. So they also have the opportunity to consult the public and hear from stakeholders. And then they enter into the second phase, which is the discussion of the evidence and a careful weighing of the options. So that's what we call the deliberative phase. After that, they usually come to a consensus recommendation, and it's not necessarily unanimity, but a very large percentage of the group is pleased with the outcome, and it's almost unanimous that this is something that they want to move forward with. They're often commissioned by government, but it's important that they not be perceived as part of government. It's important that they're run by independent, non-partisan bodies that specialize in these sorts of deliberative processes. So I think that kind of sums up the intent of them. As I said, it's important for the government to fully fund and to publicize the assembly. This is an area where there's still a lot of, examples of some that are being done well and others not so well. We see that there are occasions where governments choose to keep them a little quieter in case they don't like the recommendations. So it's to the public's advantage to make sure that everyone knows that these are happening and what the recommendations are, and everyone feels some sense of buy-in to what their fellow citizens are working on. But yeah, since the 1980s, as I said, there's been a wave of these citizens' assemblies, and it's been gaining a lot of momentum, especially in the last 10 years or so. But over the past 4 decades, hundreds of thousands of people around the world have participated in these bodies in over 500 citizens' assemblies and other deliberative processes to inform policymaking.
How long do they normally last? It seems to vary considerably.
I should say up front that I'm not an expert on citizens' assemblies. I am a citizen advocate for citizens' assemblies. So I'm sure there are more technically knowledgeable people who would be able to give you more precise answers. But we've seen examples of citizens' deliberative processes, and whether you'd call it a citizens' assembly, I guess, is a matter of some debate, but some can be as short as a weekend or 2 weekends where people get together. Some of them go on for over a year. And what I'm finding interesting now is that there is a movement to institutionalize them as permanent parallel processes. And this is happening especially in some countries in Europe. And I think this is an evolution of our democracy to become less hierarchical and to provide a permanent way for members of the general public to provide informed and meaningful input on policy in a way that they can't dive into either through processes like referendums or even processes like elections where they're asked to make a yes/no decision. It's a way to provide more in-depth and thoughtful input that comes directly from citizens themselves.
Mm-hmm. I believe there are some cases where a legislature sets up a citizens' assembly and pretty much commits from the get-go that they will implement whatever decision the citizens' assembly arrives at. I don't know whether they've ever officially done so, but I know that sometimes they're used as a way of solving an impasse that the legislature might not be able to do. For example, I believe in Ireland or Northern Ireland, I forget which, the whole question of abortion tackled by a citizen.
Ireland, in Dublin.
Well, you can tell me about it, because do you know about this one, Joyce, the one I'm mentioning?
Oh yes, that was a very, very famous example of a citizens' assembly process, because obviously in a country with a strong Catholic tradition like Ireland, abortion was a very controversial issue. There were very strong forces of women's campaigns and so on, which were very much in favour of legalising abortion in Ireland. There were also very strong church interests and more conservative groups who were passionately opposed to it. And it was like one of these kind of miracles of public consultation that Gisella's just been talking about, that they got this Citizens Assembly together, I think using the kind of method you were mentioning before, kind of partly by drawing a lottery and then by sort of correcting it for age and which region of the country they came from and all the rest of it, for the right sort of diversity. And then they had a huge power to call in evidence from various countries and various people on the history of abortion legislation and on the consequences of various kinds of abortion legislation. And at the end of it, miraculously, they more or less agreed on a major liberalisation of Ireland's abortion law.
It became much more progressive and pro-abortion than anybody expected, right?
Yeah, much more. And then that conclusion of the Citizens Assembly was put to a national referendum, at which there was massive approval of the Civic Assembly's recommendation. So it really was a textbook exercise in taking a very severe, wicked issue in a society, dealing with it through a deliberative process and reaching what was, by the end, I mean, it wasn't, as you said, it's not a complete consensus, but I mean, I can't remember what the majority was for the recommendation, but I think it was way up near 70% or something voted in favour of the recommendation in the end. So it was a pretty overwhelming victory in what people had thought would be quite a close vote. So yeah, it was a textbook exercise, really. We had one in Scotland recently on the climate question, a citizens' jury, and that produced quite a radical report on the climate question with some pretty strong recommendations. But that is kind of stumbling a bit at the implementation level. Although the Scottish Government took the report very seriously and have come out with a lot of rhetoric reflecting the recommendations of the Civic Assembly, in fact, they haven't really fully implemented all of its recommendations, and there doesn't seem to be any mechanism for making them do that. But nonetheless, it was a very powerful exercise. It began with a lot of people who were in the group who were quite sceptical about climate change, and it finished with them making an unexpectedly radical and comprehensive set of recommendations about the sort of transformation that would be needed. To deal with it.
In Ireland, the thing did follow through, though. Wasn't there a real change in laws?
Yeah, there was a total commitment from the Irish government to follow through on the findings, I think, and to put it to a referendum. But that was, if you like, a fairly simple question. When you're talking about climate change, you're talking about such a huge number of sort of systemic shifts and transitions that you couldn't really put them all to a referendum at once in that kind of way. You'd have to clarify the precise actions that the government was going to have to take, I think. Right. So it's a slightly different situation. But yeah, the Irish one was a really triumphant example of how.
But you've touched on both Meta and Joyce have touched on, I think a point that's worth highlighting again, in that these assemblies often produce recommendations which are leaps and bounds of ambition beyond what political forces are able to come up with on their own, because, this is a finding, they tend to be far more ambitious and bold in the recommendations that they make, because they aren't fettered by the political reality of getting reelected. They aren't fettered by, all of the other trade-offs that go into the decisions that politicians have to make on a daily basis. And I think that is one of their key strengths. And for a government that wants to move forward on something that is potentially controversial, this process is a way that they can not only map out what the public wants, but also it gives them cover to go ahead and actually implement those changes if they choose. And I think that the point about implementation is that it is still up to the government to make the decision. Citizens' assemblies don't have any binding rights unless they're offered, an agreement by the government in advance to say that we will simply implement whatever you recommend. But I think that is a rare thing, and I'm not sure that it's actually so wrong, because let's and I'll just use the Scottish Climate Assembly as an example, and I'm glad you brought up that example, Joyce, because it is one of the more recent ones and one of the very interesting ones. If the government were to instantly try and implement everything that the Citizens Assembly recommended, that government might be politically vulnerable, and that might all be reversed the next time when government changes. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily a bad thing that the recommendations of citizens' assemblies have to go through that layer of political scrutiny and what's the word I'm looking for? Political viability, I suppose, before they are implemented, because those are real concerns in the real world, which also bear looking at. And I think that in an ideal situation, the government would commit to doing what the Scottish government has done, which is actually to respond quite in depth to each of the recommendations that the Citizens Assembly brought forward. And then they're working on ways to actually advance those proposals. But in an ideal world, they would take the recommendations, massage them into a way that they can actually be acceptable to all stakeholders, and then move forward with them.
You were involved with one in British Columbia on voting, trying to change to proportional representation. Isn't that correct or not?
No, actually, I wasn't involved with the Citizens Assembly, which was held here in British Columbia in 2005, which, again, believe it or not, even though the process is not heavily used in Canada now, this BC Citizens Assembly on electoral reform in 2005 actually became the model for much of what has now become the wave of deliberative processes around the world. So the process in 2005 was very similar to what I described, people from all over the province, demographically representative. They did come to a near unanimous recommendation. Where it stumbled was the next step. The government chose to put that recommendation to a referendum, which I can go into lots of reasons why referendums are far from ideal and far from neutral tools to make complex policy decisions. But this is a prime illustration of how they can go wrong. The recommendation of the Citizens Assembly was put to a public referendum in conjunction with the next election, and it reached 58.5% support, but the government had set the threshold at 60. So that close we were to having a toehold for proportional representation in Canada. But again, political processes tend to be the downfall of electoral reform. And it's really difficult for politicians to put aside that self-interest and just do the right thing. So that's why in our case, in the case of electoral reform, an agreement by government in advance to step aside from the process and implement the recommendations, as wholly as possible in the environment that they find themselves in would be ideal. I think more than other cases. We've had other subjects that are less politically, less of a political football than electoral reform, and it might be easier to make those recommendations. But in the case of electoral reform, the political self-interest is obviously a very strong factor, and that's an additional reason why in the case of electoral reform, probably politicians should stay as far away from influencing the outcome of the process as possible through other approval mechanisms, like, for example, referendums, which we now know there's a lot of evidence on referendums. They tend to have a very strong status quo bias, and they don't result in informed citizen participation. It tends to be really superficial, and that's exactly the opposite of a deliberative process like a citizens' assembly.
Bernard, I know that France had a citizens' assembly about climate change. I think it was Macron who.
It was extremely interesting.
Can you tell us anything about that?
Yes, so it's very interesting, positively and negatively. It's interesting because it was a decision from above. It was a decision from President Macron. It was not coming from below at all. It was one of the results of the crisis of democracy after the Yellow Vest movement and things like that. So Macron said, let's have a citizen assembly. So this citizen assembly was selected by lottery, a lottery system, which nobody discussed. Since it was relatively fair. But what was very interesting and very positive in a way was the fact that the state gave money to a large extent, to permit the possibility of the ordinary people to follow the assembly for months, not a short time, several months. Then there was a kind of a committee, an organizing committee who was selecting experts. Of course, the people from the assembly could ask for more experts. Globally, I mean, at the beginning, there was, including myself, a lot of skepticism. But by the way, they really give the floor to a lot of different experts, and everybody said more or less, this is quite good. I mean, there was a discussion clearly place with very interesting experts and so on. Also, it was public. And of course, it was not public in the big media, but if you wanted to follow the discussion, you could.
Yeah.
So that was all this the positive aspect.
Well, you could actually sit in the room, or you could watch it.
No, you can watch it
Okay. That's
on a site.
a great idea, right there.
You couldn't intervene, but you can follow. And so everybody was puzzled, including somebody like me, at the quality of the debate. Of course, there was a learning process from the 150 people involved, and they stay. I mean, it was 150 people at the beginning, there were 149 at the end.
Mm-hmm.
So it was amazing in a way. Now, Macron, the president, had said, your proposal will be put to the National Assembly without filter. Of course, you are not going to decide. It's the National Assembly which the Parliament will decide. But me, the president, I will take all your proposal and propose it to the Assembly. Okay. Because it's a complicated question. You can say yes or no, not a referendum. So, then they, at the end, decided to put to the Assembly 2% of the proposal.
Mm-hmm.
Forgetting 2%, yes. Totally forget about it. So the result of that was a big fuss. Now you have, I think, half of the members of the Assembly, who is very different from each other at the beginning, have decided to create a specific association to promote the idea of the Assembly. It's very funny, and asked all the political parties to answer this proposal. The proposal was extremely good. I mean, quite radical, but extremely good.
Yeah.
Everybody is also puzzled by the quality of the proposal. It was not utopia, of course, it was not simple, but the fact. So it was. So the result was quite negative. I'm sure that Macron will never do that again.
Really?
He will make false citizen assembly, but a real one, really working with really the means to do it. And then the president say, okay, there will be a debate in the parliament. The members of parliament I spoke with about that was afraid of that. They didn't want to have the debate. Because if they had the debate, they were obliged to say yes or no to every proposal, and they didn't want at all to be confronted with that. So the debate they didn't have in the parliament, they didn't want to have it through this assembly. So the result finally was relatively negative because it created more frustration. But the fact it was done seriously shows it's possible. And of course, it could have been linked to the parliament, and the parliament would have said, what? Yes, no, it depends. But it would have been very interesting. So now with the new Macron government, they are saying, well, we are going to do things like that again, but nobody is believing it at all.
But nobody is what? Sorry, I couldn't hear the last.
Nobody believes them.
I mean,
oh, I see. So
everybody is thinking they are going to make false assembly, which.
Well, I got two questions really about this model of Citizens Assembly. And one is, Bernard just touched on it there, it is actually a very kind of top-down process. So it's kind of initiated by government, and in the end, the findings go back to government, and government may or may not have a good way of acting on them. So how does it relate to more bottom-up forms of activism? You know, the whole ideology of the Helsinki Citizens Assembly was about Europe from below. We weren't waiting for politicians to ask us to give our opinion about how the new Europe after 1989 should look. We were organising ourselves. The downside of that is that you have no authority. Anybody can just turn to you and say, well, who the hell are you? You know, you may have got some funding from Soros or Václav Havel or somebody, but you know, who are you? But the upside is that it's a genuine way of sort of taking a bit of power into your own hands and not waiting for government to give it to you. So how does this model of a civic assembly relate to traditional forms of civil society action, you know, whether at a local level or just people organising themselves to ask for a new school or a new playground, right up to the national level? European nuclear disarmament, a good example, a great big mass movement of people, predominantly younger people really, asking for Europe to be nuclear free, you know. And also this question that you just touched on at the very end there, how does it relate to the formal structures of democracy? Because after the Scottish Parliament was reinstated in 1999 as a devolved Parliament of the United Kingdom, I was the chair of a thing called the Scottish Civic Assembly, which was supposed to be a way for civil society organisations, whether it was churches, environmental groups, women's groups, whatever, to interact with the new Scottish Government and Parliament, and to kind of enrich the political debate, to be a kind of third leg of the political structure, the new political structure in Scotland. And after about 3 years, a lot of very mediocre politicians called us in and told us that they weren't going to fund us anymore because we weren't necessary and we didn't understand anything, which was quite funny because in that situation, none of them would have even had a job in relation to the Scottish Parliament and government if it hadn't been for the activists who had campaigned for the thing, most of whom were now in my civic assembly. So really, we were victims of a very strong hostility from the formally elected politicians who just decided they didn't want us annoying them, basically. So I think those are the kinds of issues that you have to consider when you're considering citizens' assemblies. How do they relate to the more formal structures, and particularly if they are going to be organised by governments as a deliberative element of their decision-making process? How does that relate to grassroots activists who are doing it for themselves?
Mm-hmm. I have a notion about that, and that is that you're right. As you know, the Citizens Assembly has no legal authority, and the government, the constitution of the country, always specifies what kind of system the legislature will be organized by. But, you know, I kind of think we don't like, we're not happy with or satisfied with the legislatures that are functioning now. If you do a poll, at least in North America, the public approval of Congress, for example, is in the single digits. They're the lowest of all structures of government in terms of public approval. Everybody says they do a terrible job, but you can't do without them. And then we can't just abolish them and say we will have no government until we create a new system. So what I believe in is that we should start off by having these things as created voluntarily, somebody with enough money to give us, you know, a room for a few weekends or whatever, and structure these things so that they are really, really, really representative of the population. Because I think that is one of the reasons that they do get legitimacy, because you see that these are not politicians. There's no problem with campaign financing or anybody ripping off anybody else. The Congress people, the majority of people in Congress in the US are millionaires. And people don't like it, you know, don't think, well, they're not one of us anymore. But if we really get a representative group together and they turn out to be as smart as it turns out the average population is when they get into one of these processes, they turn out to, I've been watching some of the videos of citizens' assemblies deliberating together, and it's really extremely impressive that an average cross-section of the population can make such astute comments. So I kind of think we do this on a very volunteer basis, independently, and just put it side by side with the record of what a real legislature is doing, what the results are, and show the population, look, a Citizens Assembly came up with this kind of set of recommendations, and compare that to what your real legislature did. And over time, by showing people that this turns out to work much better, and I'm assuming that it will, that this will build legitimacy. And you don't tear down what you have; you just build something better and show the rest of the world that what you have is better. And build legitimacy that way.
Yeah.
Sorry, are you suggesting, Meta, that civil society itself organises these representative citizens' juries as a way of giving civil society more legitimacy? Yeah?
Absolutely. But an organization, a civil society organization with the resources to do it. I mean, you and I can't tomorrow night, plan, but there has to be some body, such as maybe Fair Vote Canada that Gisela is involved with.
It's very tempting to do that, Meta, and I understand the appeal of that. I think where you run up against problems is two things. First of all, money, which you've already identified. Participation is voluntary, and it may involve many hours away from home and work. Members should have expenses covered. They should have daycare things, all of those things. And if you're talking about a large enough body to be representative, a meeting over a year on something as complex as electoral reform, we're talking big dollars. It's very difficult to fund that outside of government. So that's one thing, is simply money. The other point, which I think is equally concerning, is the appearance of legitimacy. And anything produced by Fair Vote Canada, for example, in terms of a Citizens Assembly on electoral reform, will always be viewed as, oh, that's those guys. Those guys are active on the electoral reform front. They have a biased agenda, and we cannot assume that the outcome of their assembly is representative of all Canadians. Whether or not it is, I think you've already lost the battle when the Fair Vote Canada name is attached to it. But I think that I'm thinking back to what Joyce asked a moment ago in terms of how does it relate to bottom up in terms of public input. Yes, the ideas and the questions are generally determined by government if they're funding it. I mean, it would obviously be something that they would have to be interested in order to do it. But the purpose of it is to provide better policy than what they could produce themselves. And I think there's, whether this covers all things that government are doing, certainly on the big issues of our time, they're probably not doing all that they could be, and anything that gives better results and gives them cover to move ahead boldly would be, and I'm thinking specifically of climate change, would be something that I would support. And I think the other part of what you're saying in terms of how do we get from recommendations to a policy that has been implemented, which I agree is largely this fuzzy thing that says, and something happens here, is to, I'm intrigued by this notion of formalizing and institutionalizing the structure of parallel citizens' bodies that are, every year people would just be pulled and rotated through them. And that would become part of government, a non-elected form of government, a citizen representative branch of government, if you will, that would have, in an ideal world, some kind of legislative clout, so that we wouldn't have to send it back to Parliament or whatever if Parliament has a conflict on that particular issue, because it's an invariable stumbling block under the system that we have, where the only people who can implement electoral reform, who can make legislation on electoral reform or any other number of topics, are the politicians. And that is a stretch goal for me, I think, in terms of, in an ideal world, we would see the growing acceptance of these citizen-led processes as legitimate forms of public expression and institutionalize them into a governance structure that doesn't necessarily have to go through a parliament per se. So those are difficult and huge systems changes, definitely worth thinking about, and as we want to renew and evolve our democracy. But in terms of first steps, I think we have to build awareness and build legitimacy in the public mind for these citizen deliberative processes, even if they are conducted by government on the topics that government wants to do at arm's length from government.
Actually, I was thinking of this as a system for the Parliamentary Assembly idea for the United Nations, because everybody now says that one of the things that the UN needs is to add an extra body besides the General Assembly and the Security Council, and ECOSOC and so on. You add another body that is actually representative of people, and the members are not nations but individuals. So we could have something like a Citizens Assembly elected by the population of the world directly, but not by voting, but by sortition, and use it as a model of course, the Parliamentary Assembly doesn't have any binding authority anyway, any more than the General Assembly does or anybody else in the UN. But it would be a very interesting exercise to show the potential of using such a body to make real decisions, and I think build legitimacy over time. But again, I don't know.
It would be really interesting to see the expansion of these assemblies go beyond national boundaries. And there is an example of one that I think you might have spoken about it earlier on a program, the Global Assembly on the Climate, Meta, which is an independent citizens assembly with 1,000 citizens from around the world taking part in a virtual convention. And I believe that they presented at COP26 last November, something I'm not super familiar with, but I know that there was this overarching international citizen-led framework that was starting to do that work, and maybe one of the other guests knows a little bit more about where that.
I think I have heard of it, but I don't know any details of how it works.
Not too informed.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the main difference between the kind of citizen assembly that Gisela has been describing and the kind that the other three of us actually experienced back mostly in the 80s was that we were a self-selected group of people who became friends. We joined because we had a concern about the issue and in no way could be taken as representative of our country. But I think that there were very real benefits. So that's true of any kind of civil society organization, however you happen to be drawn together in the first place. Oftentimes very big things come, at least in the lives of the participants.
Now I am involved in a lot of networks connected with the question of the war in Ukraine. And it's a bit strange, because on one side you have some people of the younger generation who are very, very well connected on internet, part of different groups, informal groups. On the other side, you have old-timer, including former members of HCA from Ukraine or from Russia or from the region. You have the traditional organizations still existing and playing a role, like trade unions in some countries, not everywhere. Then you have totally, for example, these impressive climate networks, Extinction Rebellion and groups like that, which are activists. The way to organize together is not so simple.
Yeah, that's true.
At the same time, of course, take myself, I have the privilege that I have been in networks of citizens from different countries. So I am quite used to the fact that you have a different wording, you have different culture, you have different history, and when you seem to speak from the same thing, and then when you look carefully, it's not exactly the same, and so on. Some of the people in the young generation have the impression that they all share exactly the same things, which is not true.
Joyce.
Well,
By the way, you have the last word because it's time for us to wind up.
Well, it was such a huge formative experience for me, really. I was about 40, really coming up for 40 when I got involved with the HCA. And I think it just, it changed me in so many ways. I learned so much particularly about Europe, that very intense period in European history. I learned about how struggles for national, I learned more than I already knew from Scottish history, if you like, about how struggles and British imperial history, about how struggles for national liberation interact with struggles for peace and democracy in both sort of negative and positive ways. I also remember very vividly just the brilliance of some of the understanding that the leaders of the organization showed. I mean, I think at our very first Congress in Prague, Mary Caldwell made a final speech saying that the real enemy of the push towards peace, democracy and human rights that we were trying to support was this kind of new form of market fundamentalism, which was risking importing the kind of wrong form of capitalism to Russia and to the rest of Eastern Europe. And I think that happened. I think the damage done by the neoliberal as opposed to the social democratic model of capitalism has been incalculable, and probably is responsible for the situation in Russia today, and therefore for the war in Ukraine. And I think as a network, we understood that. We understood that if the changes that were happening at the end of the 1980s were going to remain positive changes, then there had to be really solid work to build democratic institutions and a culture of peace, democracy and human rights alongside the economic opening up of the former communist world. And basically our leaders, our formal elected political leaders, let us down in that respect. They didn't put enough effort into that. And they exported a fairly brutal model of capitalism, which particularly in Russia and some of the former Soviet republics led to really large, a long period of human suffering. I mean, some of the statistics from that period are pretty shocking about the number of people who died prematurely and so on because of the sudden disruption of the Soviet systems. So, mistakes were made, but I think we were, as a group of citizens, a self-selecting group of citizens who were interested in all that, we knew a lot and we learned a lot about how things could have been done better. And even now, at a very great age, I'm still trying to kind of express that knowledge and wisdom that I learned at that time through the things that I write about the political situation now. And you really can't say much better than that. And you got to know some absolutely wonderful people, including both of you and Jan Faber, whom we remember this week. And also just great to meet you too, Gisela. That is really wonderful to hear all about what's happening there, and hope we can stay in touch somehow.
Thank you, Joyce. Okay. Well, there are, things do move on. As a matter of fact, Bernard and I, and Mary Caldor, and maybe some other people from our generation are participating to some extent in another effort that maybe resemble HCA more than the things that Gisela's talked about. I think it's called No More War, Citizens Assembly. And let's see what comes of that, because it can't harm, and it's a very good idea for us to stay in touch. And it's a delight seeing my old friends again and my new friend. So thank you so much.
Thank you for organizing this better, and wonderful to see you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, sometimes more. This is episode number 452. You can watch these or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. When you get to that website, look around. We have conversations there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is a place for dialogue, so please join in. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for $20 Canadian per year through Press Reader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.